The wing was hanging by prayers and rivets, and both were failing. Tech Sergeant Joseph Joe Novak stood in the pre-dawn darkness of RAF Thorpe Abbotts, staring up at what should have been impossible, a B-17F flying fortress that had returned from hell itself. Its port wing bent at an angle that made his stomach turn. The aluminum skin had been peeled back like the lid of a sardine can, exposing stringers and spars that had no right to still be connected. Hydraulic fluid dripped onto the tarmac in a steady rhythm, mixing with blood that had leaked through the fuselage seams. "Jesus Christ," whispered Corporal Eddie Schultz beside him, his toolbox trembling in his hands. "She shouldn't be here. She shouldn't be anywhere but the bottom of the channel." Joe didn't respond. His eyes traced the damage in the weak glow of work lights that cast long, accusing shadows across the hardstand. Flak holes punctured the wing in a pattern that looked like someone had taken a shotgun to it from below. The No. 3 engine was a twisted sculpture of metal and oil, its propeller blades bent backward like broken fingers. But it was the main spar, the backbone of the wing itself, that made his throat tighten. It was cracked clean through. August 17th, 1943, 14 hours earlier. The briefing room had smelled of coffee, cigarette smoke, and fear, though none of the men would ever admit to that last one. Captain James Aldrich sat in the third row, his leather jacket still cold from the morning air, watching as the intelligence officer pulled back the curtain to reveal a map of Europe. A collective groan rose from the assembled air crews. "Gentlemen," Major Harrison's voice cut through the noise like a propeller through fog. "Today's target is Schweinfurt. Regensburg would have been bad. Berlin would have been suicide. But Schweinfurt, the ball-bearing factories deep in Nazi Germany, that was a special kind of hell. 300 miles into enemy territory. No fighter escort for most of the journey. And Luftwaffe interceptors thick as hornets over a nest." Aldrich felt his co-pilot, Lieutenant Tom Brennan, shift in the seat beside him. Young Brennan, 22 years old with a wife back in Ohio and a baby he'd never met. The kid still believed they were invincible, that the B-17 was a flying fortress that could take anything the Germans threw at it and bring them home. Aldrich knew better. He'd seen too many fortresses fall from the sky trailing smoke and men. "Mission aircraft, 330 B-17s, the major continued, his pointer tapping the map. "You'll fly in 2 waves. Expect heavy flak over the target and sustained fighter attacks throughout. Weather should be clear, which means they'll see us coming." The briefing continued with altitudes, formations, radio frequencies, and rally points. Aldrich copied it all into his notebook with mechanical precision, but his mind was already in the cockpit, already feeling the shudder of flak explosions and hearing the rattle of German cannon fire. His bomber was called Memphis Belle II, an ironic name, since the original Memphis Belle had completed her 25 missions and gone home to glory. This was his 18th mission. 7 more, and maybe, just maybe, he'd see his daughter's 3rd birthday. 0847 hours, 19,000 feet over Germany. The contrails stretched behind the formation like white scars across a blue sky that had no right to be so beautiful. From his position in the pilot's seat, Aldrich could see the other B-17s of the 100th Bomb Group arrayed around him, a deadly formation of aluminum, steel, and men who were trying very hard not to think about what was coming. "Pilot to crew, check in." One by one his 9 crewmen responded: bombardier, navigator, flight engineer, radio operator, ball turret gunner, waist gunners, tail gunner. Each voice steady, professional, revealing nothing of the fear that Aldrich knew they all felt. "Fighters, 12 o'clock high." The call from Lieutenant Peterson in the top turret came, just as Aldrich saw them. Black specks against the sun that resolved into the distinctive profiles of Focke-Wulf 190s. Mean, fast, and flown by pilots who'd been killing American bombers for years. The fighters came in pairs, diving through the formation with their 20mm cannons blazing. The sky erupted with tracers, red lines from the Germans, white lines from the American gunners. The noise was incredible even through Aldrich's leather helmet. The roar of engines, the hammer of 50-caliber machine guns, the metallic pings of bullets hitting aluminum. "Bandit on our 6. He's lining up." Aldrich threw the B-17 into a banking turn, as much as a 4-engine bomber could turn, feeling the strain on the airframe as 35 tons of aircraft, bombs, and men fought against momentum and gravity. Beside him, Brennan was pale but steady, hands on his control yoke, eyes scanning the instruments. The FW-190 screamed past close enough that Aldrich could see the pilot's face. Young, determined, trying to kill him with the same professional detachment that Aldrich was trying to stay alive with. "Got him! Got him!" Sergeant Harris in the tail position, his voice high with adrenaline. "He's going down." But two more took the downed fighter's place, and two more after that. The Luftwaffe was throwing everything they had at this formation, and slowly, inevitably, bombers began to fall. Aldrich watched a B-17 from the 390th Bomb Group take a direct hit in the cockpit. The plexiglass nose exploded in a spray of glass and blood, and the bomber pitched forward into a dive it would never pull out of. He counted 3 parachutes before forcing himself to look away. "IP in 2 minutes," Lieutenant Chen, the bombardier, his voice crackly over the intercom. "Target should be visual." The flak started as they approached Schweinfurt, black puffs of smoke that bloomed in the sky like poisonous flowers, each one concealing thousands of red-hot steel fragments. The B-17 shuddered with each near miss, and Aldrich could hear shrapnel pinging off the fuselage like deadly hail. "Bomb bay doors open," Brennan announced, flipping the switch. The bomber slowed slightly as the doors yawned wide, exposing the 4,000-pound payload to the air rushing beneath them at 200 miles per hour. They were committed now. No evasive action. Just straight and level flight through the flak while Chen lined up his Norden bomb sight. Left, steady, bombs away. The B-17 lurched upward as 4 tons of high explosive dropped free. Aldrich didn't wait to see if they hit. He was already banking hard right, pulling away from the target area, trying to get his crew out of the killing zone. That's when the world exploded. The flak shell detonated 10 feet from the port wing. The concussion slammed into the B-17 like the fist of an angry god, throwing Aldrich against his harness hard enough to crack a rib. Alarms screamed. The No. 3 engine coughed, sputtered, and died, its propeller windmilling uselessly. But worse, much worse, was the sound that came from the wing itself. A metallic scream. The groan of tortured aluminum. The distinct, terrible crack of structural failure. Aldrich looked left and felt his blood turn to ice. The wing was bending. Actually bending. The entire structure flexing upward at an angle that made his engineer's mind scream that it was impossible. Through the jagged hole torn by the flak, he could see the main spar, and the crack running through it like a lightning bolt. "We're losing the wing!" Brennan's voice was high, panicked. "Captain, we need to bail out!" Aldrich's hands moved on instinct, trimming the aircraft, reducing power on the remaining engines, trying to reduce the stress on that broken wing. His mind raced through calculations. Altitude, distance to England, crew survival odds if they jumped versus if they stayed with the aircraft. The numbers were all bad. "Pilot to crew." His voice was steady despite the adrenaline screaming through his veins. "We're staying with her. Radio, get me a distress signal out. Navigator, give me a heading for home. Everyone else, throw out everything that's not bolted down. Guns, ammunition, extra equipment. I need this bird as light as possible." "Captain," Brennan started. "That wing might hold," Aldrich cut him off. "But only if we baby her all the way home. Throttle back to 170, shallow descent. No sudden movements." It was insane. It was impossible. The wing should have folded completely 30 seconds ago. But it hadn't. For the next 3 hours, Aldrich flew the most delicate mission of his life. Every air pocket made the wing flex and groan. Every minute felt like the last before structural failure. The English Channel passed beneath them like a gray promise, and then finally, the coast of England appeared through the haze. "Thorpe Abbotts, this is Memphis Bell 2 declaring emergency," the radio operator called. "We have critical structural damage. Requesting priority landing, straight-in approach, full emergency equipment." They touched down with the gentlest landing Aldrich had ever made, the B-17 settling onto the runway like a wounded bird finally allowed to rest. The brakes engaged, the bomber rolled to a stop, and only then did Aldrich allow himself to breathe. They were home. Against all odds, impossibly, they were home. But when Joe Novak climbed up to inspect the damage in the pre-dawn darkness, he knew the real miracle, or the real problem, was just beginning. 045 hours. The next morning. It can't be fixed. Major Harrison's voice was flat, final. Engineering says it requires complete wing replacement. That's a factory job. She's done. Joe stood in the operations shack, still covered in hydraulic fluid and grime from his initial inspection, facing down 3 officers who'd never held a wrench in their lives. With respect, sir, Joe said carefully, I think we can save her. Sergeant, the main spar is cracked through. That's a structural failure. You can't just… Baling wire, sir. The 3 officers stared at him like he'd suggested flying to Berlin on pixie dust. I'm sorry, what? Major Harrison leaned forward. Joe pulled a crumpled sketch from his pocket, drawn in the early morning darkness with hands that still trembled from what he'd seen. The crack runs 6 inches through the spar, but the metal on either side is still sound. If Schultz and I reinforce it with wire wrapping, multiple layers tensioned properly, we can distribute the load enough to hold. It won't be pretty and it won't be permanent, but it'll get her flying again. That's insane, the engineering officer said. Yes, sir, Joe agreed. But so is a B-17 flying 300 miles with a cracked spar. She already did the impossible once. Maybe she's got one more in her. Major Harrison studied Joe for a long moment, then looked at the sketch, then back at Joe. How long? 48 hours, sir. Maybe less if we don't sleep. And if it fails? Joe met his eyes. Then we lose 1 bomber. But if we don't try, we lose her anyway. And sir, with respect, Captain Aldrich and his crew deserve a bird that won't quit on them. This one didn't quit yesterday. I don't think she'll quit tomorrow either. The silence stretched long enough for Joe to hear his own heartbeat. You have 36 hours, Sergeant, Harrison finally said. After that, she's scrap. And if anyone asks, this conversation never happened. Understood? Yes, sir. As Joe walked back across the foggy airfield toward the waiting B-17, Eddie Schultz fell in step beside him. You really think wire will hold? The corporal asked quietly. Joe looked up at the bomber, silhouetted against the lightening sky, wounded, broken, but somehow still standing. It held them all the way home, he said. Now it's our turn to hold her together. The real work was about to begin. The work began in darkness and would end in darkness, if it ended at all. Joe Novak stood on the scaffolding beside the wounded wing, a spool of baling wire in one hand and a pair of pliers in the other, staring at the crack that shouldn't exist. At ground level, the damage had looked catastrophic. Up here, inches from the actual failure point, it looked apocalyptic. The main spar, the I-beam of aluminum alloy that ran the entire length of the wing, had a fracture that cut through 70% of its cross-section. The metal around the crack was discolored from stress and heat, warped from forces that should have torn the wing completely free at 19,000 feet over Germany. Tell me again how wire fixes this, Eddie Schultz said from the other side of the wing, his voice hollow in the pre-dawn quiet. Joe didn't answer immediately. He ran his fingers along the crack, feeling the roughness of torn metal, the slight give when he pressed. Engineering said complete replacement. The manual said catastrophic failure. Every rational part of his brain said impossible. But rationality hadn't brought this bomber home yesterday. It's not about fixing it, Joe finally said, pulling out his sketch, now covered in calculations he'd worked out during a sleepless night. It's about distribution. The spar failed because all the stress concentrated at one point. We can't make it whole again, but we can spread that load across a larger area. He pointed to his drawing with a grease-stained finger. We wrap the wire in a helical pattern, like a spring, tight enough to compress the metal back together. Multiple layers, each one tensioned individually. The wire becomes a secondary structure, not as strong as the original spar, but strong enough if we do it right. Eddie looked at the sketch, then at the crack, then back at Joe. You learned this where? Mechanic school? My uncle's farm, Joe said quietly. He had a threshing machine with a cracked drive shaft. Couldn't afford a new one, so he wrapped it with fence wire and baling twine. Lasted 3 more harvest seasons. A threshing machine isn't a B-17. No, Joe agreed, reaching for his wire cutters. But the physics are the same. Metal under tension, stress distribution, load bearing. It either works or it doesn't. And if it doesn't? Joe thought of Captain Aldrich and his crew, Lieutenant Brennan with his baby daughter, Sergeant Harris who'd shot down the German fighter, all 9 men who'd trusted their lives to this bomber once already. "Then we tell them not to fly her," he said. "But we're not there yet. Come on. We've got 34 hours left." Hour 2. 06:30. The wire was steel, 1/4-inch gauge, designed for securing cargo and emergency repairs. It wasn't meant for structural engineering, wasn't rated for the loads a bomber wing endured in flight, but it was all they had. Joe started at the forward edge of the crack, drilling tiny holes through the spar's web on either side of the fracture. Careful, precise holes that wouldn't weaken the structure further, but would give the wire purchase points. Each hole took 5 minutes to drill, deburr, and inspect. Each one had to be perfect. Eddie worked behind him, feeding the wire through the holes in a pattern Joe had mapped out on paper. Over, under, through, around. The first wrap was loose, just establishing the pattern. The second wrap was tighter. The third, tighter still. "How tight?" Eddie asked, his hands already cramping from the tension. "Until the metal starts to sing," Joe said. "You'll feel it. The wire goes taut, and the spar gives this little vibration. That's when you know you've got the right tension." It was an answer from instinct, not engineering manuals. But Joe had spent 12 years working on engines, airframes, hydraulic systems, learning by feel what instruments couldn't measure. You either developed that sense, or you killed people. Around them, the airfield was waking up. B-17s thundered down the runway on morning missions, their engines roaring a challenge to gravity in Germany. Ground crews called to each other across the hardstands. The war continued its terrible momentum while Joe and Eddie worked in their small bubble of silence, fighting their own battle against physics and time. Hour 6. 10:30. Joe's hands were bleeding. The wire had cut through his work gloves, slicing into the meat of his palms and fingers with every twist and pull. Blood mixed with hydraulic fluid, and made the pliers slippery, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Eddie was in worse shape, a deep cut across his forearm where a wire end had whipped free under tension, leaving a gash that probably needed stitches. He'd wrapped it with an oil rag and kept working. "Take a break," Joe said, not looking up from the wire pattern he was weaving. "Get that arm looked at. After you take a break. I'm the sergeant. And I'm the one who'll have to live with myself if this wing folds because I wasn't here," Eddie shot back. "So shut up and tell me how many more wraps we need." Joe allowed himself a small smile despite the pain radiating through his hands. He checked his sketch, now splattered with blood and oil. 40 more on this section. Then we move to the aft spar attachment point. Christ. Yeah. They worked in silence for another hour, the only sounds the scrape of wire on metal, the occasional grunt of effort, and the distant thunder of bombers returning from their missions. Some came back clean. Others trailed smoke or flew on 3 engines, wounded but alive. Like Memphis Belle II had been yesterday. Hour 12. 16:30. Captain Aldrich found them as the afternoon light began to fade. Joe was halfway through the aft section, his vision starting to blur from exhaustion and concentration. He didn't hear the captain approach until Aldrich spoke. "Sergeant Novak." Joe nearly fell off the scaffolding. He caught himself, turned, and saw Aldrich standing below, still in his flight suit, eyes shadowed with the kind of fatigue that came from watching men die. "Captain." Joe straightened, suddenly aware of how he must look, covered in blood, oil, and grime, swaying slightly from lack of sleep. Aldrich studied the wing in silence for a long moment. Joe waited, pliers in hand, ready to defend his impossible repair job. "Engineering says she's done," Aldrich finally said. "They say no amount of wire and hope will make her airworthy again." "Yes, sir. I heard that." "But you're doing it anyway." "Yes, sir." Another silence. Joe could see Eddie on the opposite side of the wing, frozen, waiting to see if they were about to be ordered to stand down. "Why?" Aldrich asked, and there was no challenge in it, just genuine curiosity. Joe looked at the bomber, at the bloodstains still visible on the fuselage, at the flak holes that dotted her skin like a disease, at the patched-over wounds from a dozen previous missions. He thought about all the crews that had flown her, all the men who'd trusted her to bring them home. Because she didn't quit on you, sir, Joe said quietly. She should have fallen apart over Germany. The numbers say it was impossible for her to make it back. But she did. So maybe she deserves someone who won't quit on her. Aldrich's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. How much longer? 20 hours, sir. Maybe less. And you think it'll hold? Joe looked at his wire work. Hundreds of wraps, each one tensioned by hand, each one a small prayer wrapped in steel. I think she's got one more mission in her, sir. Maybe more. But I won't know until we test her. Test her how? Engine run up tomorrow morning. Full throttle. Maximum stress. If the wing holds through that, she'll hold through flight. Aldrich nodded slowly. Then, to Joe's surprise, he began climbing the scaffolding. Captain, you don't need to. Show me what you're doing, Aldrich cut him off. If I'm going to trust my life to baling wire, I want to understand it. For the next hour, as the sun set and work lights flickered on across the airfield, Joe explained his repair to the man who would have to fly it. He showed Aldrich the wire pattern, the stress distribution, the mathematical calculations he'd done on scratch paper at 0300, while the rest of the base slept. Aldrich listened, asked questions, and occasionally reached out to touch the wire wraps, testing their tension, feeling the structure underneath. My father was a bridge builder, Aldrich said suddenly, his fingers tracing a particularly complex wrap pattern. Worked on the Golden Gate. He used to say that engineering is just organized stubbornness, refusing to let gravity and physics win. Smart man, sir. He died when a cable snapped during construction, Aldrich continued, his voice flat. Fell 300 feet into the bay. They never found his body. Joe didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He knew the risks, Aldrich went on. Knew the cable was stressed, that it was at its limits. But the schedule said it had to hold, so he trusted it. And it failed. The captain's eyes met Joe's in the harsh glow of the work lights. So when I ask if this will hold, Sergeant, I need you to give me the truth. Not what you hope, not what you think I want to hear. The truth. Joe looked at his repair work, at hours of blood and wire and desperation. He thought about all the variables he couldn't control, all the unknowns that could make this fail. He thought about what it would mean if he was wrong. Honestly, sir? Joe took a breath. I don't know. The math says it should work. My experience says it can work. But there are a dozen things that could go wrong. Metal fatigue, wire failure, stress points I haven't accounted for. If you're asking me for a guarantee, I can't give you one. But you believe it'll hold? Yes, sir, I believe it'll hold. Aldrich studied him for another long moment, then nodded. Then finish your work, Sergeant. My crew and I will be ready to fly her when you are. He climbed down and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Joe and Eddie alone with their impossible task. Hour 18, 22:30. The base had gone quiet except for the sounds of their work. Most of the crews were in the barracks, sleeping before tomorrow's missions. The ground crews had finished their shifts hours ago. Only Joe and Eddie remained, two mechanics fighting against time and physics under the stars. Joe's hands had gone numb an hour ago, which was almost a blessing. He couldn't feel the cuts anymore. Eddie had stopped talking around hour 15, conserving energy for the work. They moved in mechanical rhythm now, their bodies running on something beyond exhaustion. Last section, Eddie croaked, his voice barely audible. How many more? Joe consulted his sketch, though he'd long since memorized every line. 30 wraps, then we're done. Then what? Then we pray it holds. They worked through the night in silence, wrapping wire around aluminum, binding together what physics said should fail. The pattern was beautiful in its own way, a helical sculpture of steel spiraling around the wounded spar, each wrap supporting the next, distributing impossible loads across willing metal. Hour 24, 04:30. Joe twisted the final wire end into place, secured it with pliers that felt like they weighed 100 pounds, and stepped back. It was done. The repair looked like something from a fever dream, hundreds of wire wraps turning the spar into something organic, alive. But when Joe pressed against it testing, the metal didn't flex, didn't give. The wire held everything together in a tight embrace that might, Just might be enough. It's beautiful, Eddie said, and he sounded half delirious. It's the ugliest beautiful thing I've ever seen. Joe allowed himself to laugh, a short, exhausted bark of sound. Let's see if it works before we celebrate. They climbed down from the scaffolding on legs that barely functioned, muscles screaming from 24 hours of tension and strain. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten. Another dawn. Another day of war. Get some sleep, Joe told Eddie. Engine run-up is at 0800. I need you functional. What about you? I'm going to sit here and make sure she doesn't fall apart before then. Eddie looked like he wanted to argue, but he was too tired. He nodded and stumbled away toward the barracks, leaving Joe alone with the bomber he'd just saved, or condemned. Joe sat on the tarmac, his back against the landing gear, and looked up at the wing. In the growing light, he could see every wire wrap, every drop of blood that had gone into this impossible repair. Don't quit on us now, he whispered to the aircraft. You made it home once. You can do it again. The bomber sat silent, keeping its promises close. In 3 hours, they would find out if wire and hope were enough to hold back gravity and war. August 19th, 1943, 7:55 hours. The entire base had come to watch. Joe hadn't expected that. He'd thought it would be just him, Eddie, maybe a few engineering officers with clipboards ready to write failure reports. Instead, nearly 200 men lined the taxiway. Ground crews, mechanics, cooks, clerks, even the base chaplain. Word had spread about the impossible repair, about 2 mechanics who'd spent 36 hours wrapping a broken wing in baling wire and stubbornness. Now everyone wanted to see if Faith could fly. Joe stood beside the bomber, his hands bandaged, his body running on coffee and adrenaline. Eddie was on the opposite side, eyes red-rimmed but alert, watching the wing like a father watches a child take their first steps, terrified and hopeful in equal measure. Captain Aldrich was already in the cockpit, along with his co-pilot Brennan and flight engineer Peterson. They'd volunteered for this test despite Major Harrison offering to use a skeleton crew. She's our bird, Aldrich had said simply. We'll know if something feels wrong. The 4 engines coughed to life one by one. Number 1, number 2, number 4. Number 3, the engine that had been killed by flak, remained silent and would stay that way. They'd stripped it down to reduce weight, leaving only the nacelle as a reminder of what this bomber had survived. All ground personnel, clear the area, the loudspeaker crackled. Engine run-up commencing in 60 seconds. The crowd pulled back, but Joe stayed put. He needed to be close, needed to see every flex and strain in that wing. If it was going to fail, he needed to know why. Needed to learn from it before anyone else trusted their lives to his repairs. Eddie hadn't moved either. The 2 mechanics stood their ground as the engines began to spool up, the propellers blurring into invisible discs that pulled at the air with increasing fury. 800 hours. The noise was incredible. 3 Wright Cyclone engines at full throttle, each one generating 1,200 horsepower, all that power straining against the brakes and the wheel chocks and the earth itself. The bomber shook like a living thing trying to break free, and Joe watched the wing with an intensity that made his vision narrow to just that one critical point. The wire wraps held. He could see them flexing, see the individual strands taking load and redistributing it through the pattern he'd designed. The spar underneath wasn't moving, or rather, it was moving exactly as much as it should, flexing within tolerances that would have made engineers nervous but that Joe recognized as normal. 50% power, someone announced through a megaphone. The engine note climbed higher. The vibration increased. The wing flexed more noticeably now, and Joe's heart climbed into his throat. This was where metal fatigue would show itself, where a crack would propagate, where 36 hours of work would prove insufficient against the laws of physics. The wing held. 75%! Now the bomber was straining hard against its restraints, the entire airframe shuddering with barely contained violence. Joe could see individual wire wraps vibrating in resonance with the engines, could see the stress patterns in the metal around his repair. His mind raced through calculations, load distribution, stress concentration, failure modes, but his eyes never left that wing. The chapel bells chose that moment to ring, calling the faithful to morning mass. The sound cut through the engine roar like a blade. Clear, pure, impossibly delicate against the mechanical fury. Joe found himself praying without words, a desperate plea to whatever god watched over mechanics and the men who flew broken machines. 100% power. The world became noise. The engines screamed their defiance at gravity. The propellers bit into the air with savage efficiency. Every rivet, every seam, every weld in the bomber's structure was being tested at the absolute limit of its design. And the wing held. Joe couldn't breathe, couldn't blink, couldn't do anything but watch as his impossible repair faced the judgment of physics and reality. The wire wraps were singing now, literally singing, vibrating at frequencies that produced an eerie harmonic that threaded through the engine roar like a ghost trying to be heard. 30 seconds at full power. 45. 60. Throttling down, the megaphone announced. The engine note dropped. The vibration eased. The wing settled back into its normal at-rest position, the wire wraps going quiet, the metal relaxing from its state of maximum stress. Joe's legs gave out. He sat down hard on the tarmac, his body finally acknowledging what his mind had been denying. That he'd been holding his breath. That every muscle had been tense to the point of cramping. That he'd been convinced for 60 seconds that he was about to watch his work fail catastrophically. But it hadn't failed. Eddie was beside him suddenly, pulling him to his feet, laughing and crying at the same time. It held! Holy Christ, Joe, it held! Around them, the crowd erupted in cheers. Men were clapping, shouting, some of them openly weeping. The chaplain was making the sign of the cross, his lips moving in what Joe imagined was either a prayer of thanks or sheer disbelief. The engines shut down one by one, and in the sudden relative quiet, Joe heard the cockpit canopy slide open. Captain Aldrich stood up, looked directly at Joe across 50 feet of tarmac, and snapped a salute that belonged to generals, not sergeants. Joe, still dazed, returned it. 0930 hours. The operation shack smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke, familiar and grounding after the surreal chaos of the engine test. Joe sat across from Major Harrison, aware that Eddie was standing just outside the door, trying to look casual while clearly eavesdropping. Engineering reviewed the test data, Harrison said, tapping a folder full of charts and graphs that meant nothing to Joe's exhausted brain. They're calling it a miracle, or insanity, possibly both. Will they clear her to fly, sir? Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Joe with an expression that might have been respect or might have been concern. They're clearing her for one mission, one test flight with a full crew and combat load. If she holds through that, they'll reassess. That's all we need, sir, Joe said. One chance to prove she's still got fight left in her. Captain Aldrich has already volunteered his crew. Said if anyone's going to test your wire work at altitude, it should be the men who already owe their lives to this bomber. Harrison paused. They fly tomorrow. Berlin. Joe felt his stomach drop. Berlin. The most heavily defended target in Europe. More than 600 miles of enemy territory. Sustained fighter attacks and flak so thick you could walk on it. If there was a mission designed to test every weakness in an aircraft, Berlin was it. Sir, maybe we should start with something easier. A milk run to... There are no milk runs anymore, Sergeant, Harrison cut him off. And they need every bomber they can put in the air. The war doesn't pause because one B-17 has a wounded wing. Joe nodded slowly. He'd known this was coming, but the reality of it still hit like a physical blow. Tomorrow 9 men would trust their lives to wire wraps and prayers. Tomorrow, he'd find out if his impossible repair was a miracle or a death sentence. Dismissed, Sergeant. Get some sleep. You look like hell. Joe stood, saluted, and walked out into the morning sun that felt too bright, too normal for a world where men were about to fly into hell on wings held together with baling wire. August 20th, 1943, at 0530 hours, Joe stood on the tarmac in pre-dawn darkness, watching the ground crews fuel and arm Memphis Belle II for her test flight. Eddie was beside him, neither of them speaking, both of them thinking about what today would prove. Captain Aldrich approached from the direction of the briefing rooms, his crew behind him. They looked tired. They all looked tired these days. But there was something else in their eyes. determination, trust. The kind of faith that men develop when they've survived the impossible once and believe they might do it again. "Sergeant Novak," Aldrich stopped in front of Joe. "I wanted to thank you before we go up. Whatever happens today, you gave us a chance. That's more than most broken birds get." Joe wanted to say something meaningful, something that would capture the weight of this moment. But words felt inadequate, so he simply extended his hand. Aldrich shook it firmly, then climbed into the bomber with his crew. 06:15 hours. The formation lifted off in waves, 30 B-17s climbing into the dawn, their contrails writing promises across the sky. Memphis Belle II was in the middle of the formation, flying straight and level, her 3 good engines pulling her toward Germany and whatever waited there. Joe watched from the tower with Eddie and a crowd of other mechanics who'd worked through the night preparing bombers for this mission. No one spoke. There was nothing to say that the distant engine roar didn't already communicate. "She looks good," Eddie finally whispered. "She looks alive," Joe corrected. 14:45 hours. The afternoon was dying when the bombers came home. They arrived in pieces, 1s and 2s and scattered stragglers, some trailing smoke, others flying on damaged engines, all of them marked by flak and fighters and the terrible arithmetic of war. Ground crews counted them in, waiting for the numbers that would tell them who'd made it and who hadn't. 23 bombers returned. 7 were missing. Joe stood on the hard stand assigned to Memphis Belle II, his heart hammering against his ribs as he scanned the approaching aircraft. There, that one, third from the left, flying slightly low but steady. 3 engines, familiar silhouette. She was coming home. The B-17 touched down with what looked like a perfect landing, rolled down the runway, and taxied toward her hard stand. As she got closer, Joe could see new flak damage, fresh holes in the fuselage, a section of tail damaged, the plexiglass nose cracked. But the wing, his wing, was intact. The engines shut down. The crew began emerging from hatches, and Joe saw immediately that something was wrong. They were moving too carefully, helping each other down with the gentle attention that meant someone was hurt. Aldrich was the last to exit, and when he did, Joe saw the blood, a lot of it, soaking through the captain's flight suit from a wound in his side. "Captain," Joe started forward, but Aldrich waved him off. "It's not bad. Flak fragment. I've had worse." He gripped the side of the aircraft to steady himself, then looked at Joe with eyes that held something beyond exhaustion. "Your repair held, Sergeant. We took fire directly on that wing, 20mm cannon from an Me-109. Blew through the upper surface 3 feet from your wirework. The whole bird was shaking like she'd tear apart." Aldrich's voice was getting weaker, but he kept talking, needed to finish. "But that wing didn't fold, didn't flex, didn't fail. Your wire held everything together even when physics said it shouldn't." He pushed away from the aircraft, wavered slightly, then extended his hand to Joe one more time. "You saved my crew twice now. Once when you refused to scrap her, and again when you believed wire could beat gravity." Joe shook the captain's hand, unable to form words around the emotion blocking his throat. Medics arrived and took Aldrich away on a stretcher he probably didn't need, but didn't have the strength to refuse. His crew followed, some limping, all of them alive. Joe turned back to the bomber and walked slowly around her, cataloging the new damage. When he reached the port wing, he climbed up to inspect his repair work. The wire wraps were still tight, still singing slightly in the wind. But he could see where the 20mm round had punched through, a ragged hole in the upper skin that had missed the spar by less than 3 feet. If the German pilot had aimed just slightly different, if the round had hit the repair instead of passing by. But it hadn't. Eddie appeared beside him on the scaffolding. "They're calling it the Berlin Express now. Said she flew through hell and brought everyone home." Joe ran his fingers over the wire wraps, feeling the tension still holding, still distributing load across wounded metal. "She needs more work. The hydraulics are leaking. That cannon damage needs patching, and I want to reinforce 2 more sections of the spar before she flies again." "So she will fly again?" Joe looked at the bomber, battered, bleeding hydraulic fluid, held together by repairs that no engineering manual would approve. But alive, still fighting. Yeah, he said quietly. She'll fly again. August 25th, 1943. 1 week later. Joe stood in Major Harrison's office, more uncomfortable than he'd ever been in 3 years of military service. The major was holding a piece of paper that looked official and somehow threatening. The Army Air Force's Technical Service Command wants a full report on your repair methodology, Harrison said. They're calling it Field Expedient Structural Reinforcement, and they want to know if it can be standardized for other damaged aircraft. Joe blinked. They want to teach people to use baling wire on broken spars? Apparently, 3 other bomb groups have tried similar repairs based on rumors about what you did. 2 worked. 1 failed during ground testing. No casualties. But they're being careful now. Harrison set down the paper. You might have accidentally invented a way to keep damaged bombers in the war, Sergeant. Joe didn't know what to say to that. He'd been trying to save 1 aircraft, 1 crew. The idea that his desperate improvisation might become standard procedure was both humbling and terrifying. There's something else, Harrison continued. Captain Aldrich put you in for a commendation. Said you exemplify the kind of technical excellence and dedication that wins wars. It won't be a medal, you know how the brass feels about non-combat awards, but it'll be in your file. I was just doing my job, sir. Your job was to tell us the bomber was scrap, Harrison corrected. Everything else was you refusing to accept the impossible. After the meeting, Joe walked back across the airfield toward Memphis Belle II. She was on her hard stand, surrounded by ground crew performing routine maintenance. Eddie was there, naturally, arguing with someone about proper torque specifications. The bomber looked different now. New patches covered old wounds. Fresh paint tried to hide the scars. But if you knew where to look, and Joe always knew where to look, you could see the wire wraps underneath the patched skin, still there, still holding. You hear the news? Eddie called down from the scaffolding. They're sending us to training command. We're supposed to teach other mechanics the wire repair technique. Who's us? You and me. Apparently, we're experts now. Eddie grinned. Never thought I'd be teaching anyone anything except how to get yelled at by sergeants. Joe climbed up to join him, and together they looked at the bomber they'd saved. The aircraft that had flown 6 more missions since Berlin, that had brought home crews who wouldn't have had a chance in any other bird, that had become proof that sometimes faith and wire were enough. Think she'll make it to 25 missions? Eddie asked. Joe touched the wire wraps one more time, feeling them hum with a frequency only his hands seemed to recognize. I think she'll make it as long as we keep believing she can. The afternoon sun caught the bomber's aluminum skin, making her glow like something between machine and miracle. In a week, Joe would be teaching other mechanics his impossible repair. In a month, dozens of damaged bombers would fly again because of baling wire and stubbornness. In a year, the technique would save hundreds of lives. But right now, in this moment, all Joe cared about was that Memphis Belle II was ready to fly again. Held together by wire, sustained by hope, and kept in the air by the refusal of 2 mechanics to let physics and war have the final word. Come on, Joe said, climbing down. That hydraulic leak isn't going to fix itself. You ever think about taking a break? After the war, Joe promised. After the war, I'll take all the breaks you want. They went back to work as the sun set over RAF Thorpe Abbotts, 2 mechanics among thousands, keeping broken birds flying, keeping hope alive, proving every day that sometimes the most important victories weren't won in the sky. They were won on the ground, with wire cutters and pliers and the stubborn belief that impossible just meant it would take a little longer. The bombers would fly tomorrow. They would face fire and fear, and all the terrible mathematics of war. But tonight, they rested on English soil, held together by the hands and hearts of men who refused to let them fall. And that, Joe thought, was victory enough. The end. Author's note. While this story is fiction, it is inspired by real accounts of field repairs performed by U.S. Army Air Force's ground crews during World War II. The ingenuity, dedication, and courage of these mechanics kept bombers flying under impossible circumstances and saved countless lives. Their work, often unsung, was as vital to victory as any combat mission.